With the religious struggles at the time, a second Protestant church was built in 1770, and that became the future site of United Church. I also noted that the diversity began to come very slowly in New Haven. We all think of the Puritans, the Blue Laws, which originated in New Haven. But over time, there began to be little bits and signs of the diversity that was to come. The first Italian, William Diodati of Genoa, was noted in 1717. And then a Yale president, Timothy Cutler, was fired for converting to Anglicanism, the Episcopal Church, in 1722. 38 Irish servants noted in 1754, 5 Acadian families, 1757, and even a family of Venetian Jews were noted by Ezra Stiles in his diary of 1772. By the time of the Revolution, the population of New Haven was about 4,000, including 273 African Americans, some slaves, some free. In a map that Stiles drew at that time, he shows an octagonal red fence around the cemetery. And Stiles was great for drawing maps. He drew maps of the British invasion of New Haven, of Indian lands throughout Connecticut. Now, in New England, most of the burial grounds were owned and operated by the town, not the church. But in New Haven, of course, town and gown, I should say church and gown, were one. And also the people at Yale, too, although they were even more strict than the town. And the burying ground continued to spread behind the meeting house. Now, families could also maintain their own burial plots at home. Gravestones did not come into extensive use until the mid-1650s. And the Puritans had no desire to have fields of monumental markers. But over time, family wanting to commemorate their own, first put out wooden markers, then stone markers. And at first they were just simple field stones with simple lettering. Ornamentation began to grow in the form of death's heads in the late 1600s that followed the English custom. And the death's head consisted often of a winged skull located at the top of the gravestone. And with stone markers, one can generally trace the evolution of style within the framework of the Puritan burial practices. There was this plain style I mentioned that was mainly the name. That was from 1640 to 1710. The death's head from 1670 to 1770. The angel that you see, the angel wings, or the soul reaching to the heavens. It's from 1740 to 1820. This began when there was no longer the feeling of predestination, that no matter how good you were, you could still be predestined to go to hell. And finally, the urn and the willow, which was the sign of the memorializing, finally, and the reverence for the dead that began about 1780. Now, after the Revolution, there was even more stress and use upon the green, because in 1784, New Haven incorporated itself as a city. But the upper green was really in a state of dilapidation. It was described as a board fence that was falling down around the cemetery. There were old buildings about to be removed. And many people began to pass away into the 1780s and especially the 1790s. And some of the most dramatic descriptions I've seen of these epidemics and deaths that swept through the town were recorded by Ezra Stiles. His papers are at Yale, but his diary has actually been published. He kept a detailed diary of his presidency from 1778 until he died in 1795. And these large number of deaths motivated the creation of the first planned corporate cemetery in the world by James Hillhouse, who graduated in 1773. We still don't really know where he got this wonderful idea, and I'll speak about it in a moment more, but no one else seems to have given him the idea or any copied it from anyone else. And just to give you an idea of these just the amount of deaths and how quickly death could come to the seniors. And remember, and the lower classes as well. Remember that Yale was facing the green and facing these very, very same spots that some of them might end up in a day or two. They had to look out on the graves of their own friends. And Stiles recorded in March of 1794 that Bacchus, a freshman, was taken sick and died the next day of the angina ulcerosa at the age of 17. The physicians, judging it impossible to keep the corpse, which he spelled C-O-R-P-S, until tomorrow, the funeral of Bacchus was attended after meeting. More students sickened, 4 with scarlatina. The student body was terrified and petitioned for dismissal, but it was not until after attending more funerals, and Stiles and his wife were also taken sick themselves, that he released as many scholars to go home as were frightened. In September of 1794, he wrote that 27 New Haveners died of yellow fever. Stiles wrote his last entry 2 days before his own death in May of 75 of something described as bilious fever. So James Hillhouse, who was known as a New Haven entrepreneur, the Yale treasurer, and a U.S. senator, devised this entirely new plan for a cemetery. No longer just a graveyard where people were buried hit or miss in the order in which they died, and when you ran out of space, you could kind of compress or even empty out a coffin and put someone else in it. He laid out a plan for squares with streets and numbered lots, where lots could be purchased by families and organizations, by churches, and it would be landscaped and provided for the first time for perpetual care. It was called a city of the dead, where for the first time people could be honored and memorialized. Some people think of Père Lachaise in Paris as being the first of its kind, but it actually started 10 years after the Grove Street Cemetery. And people came from all over the world to see this new style of burying. So in September of 1796, he set up a meeting of 32 concerned citizens who signed an agreement stating that, quote, having experienced many inconveniences from the small portion of ground allotted for the burial of the dead at the center of the city, to obtain larger, better arranged for the accommodation of families, and by the retired situation, better calculated to impress the mind with a solemnity becoming the repository of the dead, do advance each $14 to pay the purchase money of 6 acres of land for a burying ground. So this land was called the suburbs. This was north of the 9 squares facing on Grove Street. And it went up to the area where eventually some of the land was cut off to build the Farmington Canal. So here you had all these graves on the green, thousands of them, nobody really knew how many, and hundreds of gravestones. So there was a period of moratorium. Individual gravestones and even remains, as the families wished, could be removed, and this lasted until 1821, when finally the remaining tombstones that were on the green were carried by a procession of Yale students and carried them individually to the back wall of the cemetery, where they're now arranged in alphabetical order. And for the first time, families were reunited by their last name into family groups. Now, most of the remains, practically all of them as far as we know, stayed on the green. Well, in 1795, Temple Street was cut through, and it came right along the side of the sideways center church. And so a new church was built. And what to do about building it over the burying ground? The decision was made to build the church over the burying ground, and as you know, that area in the basement is now known as the crypt. There are 137 gravestones in the crypt, but tests that have been made over time have shown that there could be even up to 1,000 remains under the church. And one test boring that was made in the middle of the last century showed that, actually it was in 1849, that in a small square they found remains of 16 people. So in 1828, then a big change came to the green when a large and impressive Greek temple-like style Connecticut State House was built over the rest of the cemetery behind the meeting house. This lasted until finally the State House was raised in 1889 and the upper green was landscaped. So 20 years later, in 1909, you have the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln and the move around the country to plant memorial trees for the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. And part of this movement was President William Howard Taft. He was serving on the Yale Corporation at this time, was elected president in 1908, but was so loyal to New Haven and Yale that he did not even give up his seat. He continued to come to New Haven in his private train to go to meetings in New Haven while he was the president. He also was the one who spearheaded the Yale Committee to plan for the magnificent Civil War memorial that we have on the Yale campus. And the place where the tree was planted was about the place on the upper green where the Reverend Leonard Bacon had led the public in prayer the day after Lincoln's assassination. The tree planting ceremony was held by the Civil War veterans of the Grand Army of the Republic, Admiral Foote Post, on April 9, 1909, on the anniversary of the Battle of Appomattox, and it was the nearest anniversary to Arbor Day. Some news articles mentioned that it was on the site of the State House, but no mention at all was made in the papers in 1909 that there was a graveyard underneath it. A poem of 15 stanzas was composed and read on the occasion. And time capsules were buried. But as with time capsules, you could have a great ceremony at the time you bury them. But when do people know that they're there? Over time, they're forgotten. And it's very hard to keep track of them. So the hopes that were expressed in the poem that was composed for the occasion, A Prayer for Our Tree, that looking ahead to a timeless future, of course, came to an end in 2012, but a new tree was planted. And just to conclude, I'd like to share just a few lines of that 15-stanza poem. Our gracious Father, we invoke thy blessing on our Lincoln oak. Temper rude storms that round it fly. Let summer breezes through it sigh. Let's hope its giant branches wide will spread abroad on every side, that when a century hath flown, it may not then be fully grown. Of course, those dreams didn't really all come true, but we do have a wonderful story that we can all share, and a wonderful collaboration between history, archaeology, science, so many different areas. So I'm looking ahead to the next chapter.